Welcome back, everybody, to the Holy Fire Podcast. I'm Father Justin Waltz, and this is Catholic Lives Matter. In this drop of Catholic Lives Matter, we are returning to the very powerful and moving testimony of Lance Goetz in my interview with him. So without further ado, episode 2 of my interview with Lance Goetz.
In the beginning of the hospital stay, they actually tried to knock me out. I was awake and kept trying to pull out the ventilator. I kept fighting like crazy, but I was awake. And when they finally got the ventilator out, I made a point of trying to make people laugh because I could see the stress. But for the first 6 days, because of all the surgeries and because of the pain, they gave me a drug that made me forget what was going on. And I couldn't remember 6 days, so I kept on asking what was happening. And the last time I asked my mom what happened, I'll never forget it, because I made her answer me, "Mom, what happened? What happened to me?" over and over again. And she had to relive one of her most horrible moments again and again. "Well, my baby," because I'm her youngest, you got hit by a train. And I remember the feeling of being devastated, and I remember looking at my legs and seeing it was so bizarre because, well, my fibulas, they couldn't even work on. And my tibias were just being held together with basically bolts and nuts and screws and pins and wires and all kinds of metal. I remember looking down at my right leg, and the drainage tubes were all over. It was 10 times the normal size and bright red, and blood was leaking through the gauze all over. And I looked down at my right leg, and I wondered what the heck happened there. Well, they basically stripped the latissimus muscle off my back to replace all the muscle that was ruined there. They had to replace muscle in my right leg and my left leg as well, but this was so much, and such running basically all the way up my shin. And then they had to skim off the skin from my other leg to put it over the top. They had a big hole running from the top of my chest cavity down to my pelvis, basically a scar that they had to leave open because stomach scars are bizarre when they heal. So it's like I had an somewhat open hole right down the center of my gut. I wanted to know what happened. And when she told me I got hit by a train, all I could feel was extreme remorse. Not for myself, but I could see the pain that I put my mom through, and I made her cry. I never want to make my mother cry. And after that, she gave me a few moments, and I remember trying to turn my head to the left, and I couldn't because, well, they had to sew my ear back on, and all I could see was the sink and stainless steel wall. I tried looking out to the right, turned my head to the right, and I saw windows filled with all the other patients, and at first it was a little uplifting, but then I remember they were going through their own tragedies. I tried a distraction somewhere and looked at the TV, but it was just babbled nonsense on the television. I couldn't hold any train of thought. But eventually I saw the crucifix on the wall of St. Alexis Medical Center. And the crucifix showed me Jesus suffering in a way that I will never know. He had those holes in his wrists, and I looked at the hole in my wrist where they were trying to repair and did nerve surgery and repair all the nerve endings, and I saw the holes in his feet, and I knew my feet, well, besides sewing some toes back on, the scars on my feet. I saw the hole in his side. Well, the hole in my side was now a colostomy bag and a giant exploratory cut down my stomach. I had scars all over my head, and it seemed like every single scar of the stigmata I had somewhere in some relative way on my body. And instead of feeling sad about that, I felt empowered, because I was a little bit like Jesus. And I remember praying, and this prayer was the best prayer I ever had. I asked God that if he could use this suffering, which I'm going to have probably for the rest of my life, use this suffering to help others, maybe to help minimize their suffering. Maybe I can suffer in place of them. And it gave me a purpose. It gave me a position where I felt good about where I was. And I actually was in a much, much better place with such an extreme trauma. But then I just kind of kept looking at the clock tick away, which was right beside the crucifix. And it's like Satan was living in every second that slowly ticked on. And as the clock kept ticking, and even a minute was just pure agony, I started to consider, well, I asked to be like Jesus and that I could sacrifice, but I'm not Jesus. I'm not important like him. I'm not even close to who he was, who he is. I wanted to be so like him, but I knew I was so far from him. And I realize now that my prayer was on point, that we can use our suffering and offer it up in our prayers. I realize now that I was on point, but back then I was an 18-year-old kid that went from captain and of the football team and starting varsity basketball and football to a newly created cripple. That prayer to Jesus and trying to be like him was the best prayer I had. And I think if we can always try to live with that in our hearts, that's where I'm at now. When my pain is really bad, I try to offer it up. I try to give it to someone else. In the ICU room, I was lucky because of the community. People were coming, even sneaking into the ICU, and you're not allowed to come into the ICU, but people were sneaking in just to see me. And people would come, like, repeatedly, one after the other. The community from St. Mary's was wonderful, but in ICU, one more thing happened that was very bizarre. A surgery happened where they told my mom it wasn't going to be as big of a deal, so my dad went home. He had to go milk cows, and he went home and tried to get some sleep. And my mom, it was a surgery that was going longer than it was supposed to. And in fact, it was close to an 18-hour surgery. It was a surgery where they stripped a muscle off my back and tried to attach that muscle onto my leg. And during that surgery, while they told my mom it wasn't going to be a big deal, it was running so late, so my mom found an ICU waiting room, which was a really, really small waiting room, and she didn't want anyone to see her, so she took the couch, kind of laid it down, and then laid behind it on the floor, because she can't sleep if she thinks anyone sees her. The next day, they told her that they lost me 3 times. They lost me 3 times and had to bring me back. That ended up being a lot more than they expected, and I pulled through. And when my mom came in to talk to me, she asked how I was, and I said, I'm fine. I saw you last night, Mom. I walked over to you. I saw you and walked over to you. Lance, that's not right. And she thought I forgot again. I didn't forget. She said, no, Lance, you can't walk. Your legs are, you can't walk. No, Mom, you're wrong. I did walk. I walked over and I saw you and I laughed at you. I laughed at you because you were laying on the floor instead of on the couch. I didn't understand why you were doing that. And I felt so much love. And usually I felt ashamed. When I was awake, when I was conscious, when I was in my own body, I felt ashamed at everything. I made my mom sad, but then I felt love. I saw her and I only saw that she was in so much pain because she loved me so much. And that made me happy that she had so much love. I laid down next to you. I put my arm around you and I laid with you for a while. And then I went home to see Dad, which of course is impossible. I'm in the middle of a surgery. They're trying to bring me back to life and I'm being wrecked from inside out. But I went home to see my dad on the farm 30 miles away. And I told her I saw Dad, and it made me smile because Dad was sleeping on top of the covers. He still had his blue jean shorts on. He still had his socks on. And he was snoring like crazy, like a chainsaw. And I was smiling, and I heard the alarm go off, and so I helped him wake up to go milk cows. And then I came back here. And I realized later, there's no way I could know any of this. There's no way I could know that my mom nobody saw her in the ICU waiting room in the middle of the night at 2 a.m. There's no way I could know that my dad was sleeping on top of the covers with his socks still on. There's no way I could have known any of that unless I was outside my body. And I would have loved it if I saw, a great white light and had conversation with my guardian angel. But instead, I learned something perhaps even more important. That even in our most desperate moments, I only felt love. I only felt love. In their pain, I knew that pain was only caused because they loved so much. And the other side of love, we always think of this rosy, wonderful candy and hearts at Valentine's Day, and we always only think of that side of it. But love is also going to be the most devastating moment of our lives. But it's only because we love so much that we feel that way. It showed me a lot about what the afterlife was going to be. It was going to be an understanding of love, even in our hardest moments. And pride and caring and rooting for those we care about. Not judging or anything like that, but just glad to be with them. It took me a long time to get out of the hospital. They were amazed that I was able to get out in under a month. But basically, I had to live in a hospital bed in my parents' living room for the next year. And they tried to have me up walking in about a year, but my leg basically bent into an L as soon as I put any weight on it. And the metal plate that was holding it together, they had to take it out, and they put rods down my legs. That didn't work. They put another rod down my leg. I was doing so well. I had this miracle, and I had faith, and I had people visiting me, and I was doing so well. But I didn't understand why these surgeries were failing, why I was failing. I didn't understand why God was not helping me more as He was helping me. And the more surgeries failed and the longer it took, my friends, of course, they went off to college. All of a sudden, I wasn't having people around me anymore. All of a sudden, I was alone all day. Maybe see my family a little bit, but I was being surrounded in pain and solitude. Eventually, they put something on my leg called an external fixator. It was the first external fixator put on in North Dakota. I know this because the doctor didn't want to do it initially, and he said he'd try it, but he was trying to get me to go out of state to have it done. And hindsight, he did his best. He was a good doctor, a very good doctor, but this was a very difficult surgery where he basically put pins and wires perpendicular, sliding them through my flesh and through my bone, and then screwing them around a giant apparatus. Over 18 different places I had to clean with hydrogen peroxide and saline every day to guard from infection. But it was his first time putting this fixator with all these wires going through my leg on, and he wanted me to walk on it. He wanted me to try to put weight on my leg that kept failing and breaking. And it was so painful. I couldn't move because the wires were loose. The wires were loose, and so they moved and shook and rocked through my muscle and my bone every time I tried to move. I grab onto the metal cage and wires and lift my leg up like some perverse piercing and just try to move my leg around a little bit to someplace comfortable. But there was never any place comfortable. As I was more and more alone, it was a place where I desperately needed more guidance. I loved Jesus, but I was feeling very much like I was being punished, like I was no longer someone God cared to look at, like I was no longer His attention. And slowly that turned into the idea that maybe God hates me. And it's not that I didn't have faith that there was a God. It's just belief that you're on his bad side is probably even worse. And night after night, my parents would get up and go milk cows at 3:30, 4 a.m., and I'd be still awake, struggling, just trying to make it, just trying to get through. The pain in my leg was just so overbearing. And that pain and that solitude put me in a place where my faith started to crack. Eventually I broke down. I remember the night very specifically because my parents came in and said good night. It was 4 a.m. They were going to milk cows and I was wide awake. I wanted to sleep. I wish I could sleep. Sleep was the only place that seemed I had respite, but the pain I was going with this loose fixator was driving me nuts. And I started to break down. I grabbed my book and I wrote down how much could the railroad pay me to feel like this, hoping maybe there was a lawsuit. I didn't care about the lawsuit. I was just thinking about the pain and what this worth. 1 million? No. 1 million, it's not enough. 7 million? No. 100 million? No. There's nothing anyone could pay me to go through this. And then I started to think about, why would God, doesn't he care about me? Why would God allow me to hurt like this? I didn't understand. I was blaming him for every evil of the world because I wanted him to be a parent that hovered over me and protected me from every little bad thing that could ever happen, instead of being a parent that, started me on the bicycle and then let me ride and fall and pick myself up. I was blaming every single bad thing in the world when he was every good thing in the world. I was frustrated. I was alone. And in that frustration, I remember I started to break down. In this conversation I tried to have with him, asking him to talk to me, I ended up asking him, why, God? Why would you let me do this? What did I ever do? Why don't you help me? Why don't you say something to me? And eventually I stared at the ceiling and felt empty, and I did something I regret. I cursed God. And it's funny, at that moment, it's like 100 bricks were dropped on my chest. At that moment, I realized I wasn't carrying this cross alone. There was help this whole time that I didn't realize. It's like I finally truly understood despair, because despair was trying to suffer without God, trying to go through this without faith. I needed to have faith if I was ever going to survive. And even though me cursing him didn't mean I didn't believe in him, I just was mad at him. An angry prayer. But I never felt worse. I instantly started apologizing. Instantly, I'm sorry. And I remember breaking down and crying. I can only remember maybe 5 times crying after my wreck. And this was definitely one of them. I bawled myself to sleep that night. And I woke up praying again, God, please be with me. The struggles kept going. And the more my surgeries failed and the more my legs just kept busting and breaking, because they were just so wrecked. They were just so demolished. The more I struggled to have faith. I let myself go down a very dark path, and more surgeries happened, then more surgeries happened, and the more they failed and the more frustrated I'd try to hide from my parents and those that loved me and hang out with those that would allow me to destroy myself. I'd find friends that thought it was okay for me to drink alcohol or just do whatever I wanted to do, because that made me feel a little bit better. That it was okay that the doctors were giving me more and more Oxycontin, more and more Oxycontin, more and more Oxycontin. That was okay. You deserve that. And eventually I broke down, and I came close to thinking, I came close to taking the 9mm I had, and that I bought for only one reason. And I remember what it tasted like. And at that moment, I thought of my mom crying. I thought of my dad upset over my grave. I thought of my family and those who love me and how I would have given them all my pain. And then even though I couldn't really kneel, I had braces that went up from my toes to my knees. But I kneeled on those braces and I begged God, please help me carry this load. Please help me make my life better. Please help me again. And by breaking down and falling into nothing, that's when I started to trust, because I surrendered everything. And I was able to slowly build myself back up. I ended up moving out of the house I was in and the people I was with. I ended up trying to get myself completely off Oxycontin, even though the doctor had no problem continuing to give me that prescription. I still had lots of pain, and I still took painkillers, but I would allow myself to even go through withdrawals at the end of every month as I tried to stop taking them. I moved to another... I was trying to go to college. During all this time, I ended up no money and dropping out of college left and right because, well, every time I'd start college and get halfway through, I'd have another surgery that was so demanding and overbearing that I had to drop out or miss 3 weeks of college and then try to go to college while I was struggling with pain that would distract me from anything that they were saying. But now I was praying to Jesus. Now I was having a little bit more help. Now I wasn't trying to do it all alone and control it all myself. I could surrender it and trust Him. I ended up having 2 more external fixators put on my legs. They had to regrow and cut out and drag bone through my body slowly for 2 years. But I wasn't alone. I had some faith, and I admit I went up and down. I had to keep trying. And that's the thing I think people forget. They think that it's easy for everybody, that you're just automatically faithful, that you don't have to reconnect and retry, and that you're allowed to fall down sometimes in your faith and then pick yourself back up. And in fact, in that, you can rebuild yourself. You can rebuild yourself into someone who's connected even more with Christ. But this is something I had to figure out with pain, physical and emotional.
This is the Holy Fire Podcast, and I'm Father Justin Waltz. Join us next week as we release the 3rd part and the conclusion of the Lance Goetz interview.